Welcome to another episode on the Home Tech Talk podcast. My name is Jake.
And my name is Aiden.
Before we get started on this week's episode, if you are liking our content and would like to contribute to our cause, we have a PayPal link below in our notes, so please feel free to check it out. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up to date.
In today's episode, we were lucky enough to catch up with Australia's most awarded home cinema designer and builder, who is currently in the process of launching their very own speaker brand into the Australian market.
And this week we'll be kicking off our Australian product series and learning more about an Australian-owned and made speaker brand, Elementi Audio, with David Moseley, who is the owner and head designer. He also operates and owns Wavetrain Cinemas. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you.
Hello, thanks for joining us. Thanks for coming in. Do you want to give us a bit of a quick background on how you ended up, where you ended up, being the cinema builder, the now speaker manufacturer?
That's a pretty long story. So
A long story. We'll go the short version. We've had a few long versions in the past.
Yeah. So Wavetrain Cinemas has been operating for a lot of years, as you know. So I'd have to think exactly how long. Probably about 18 years, I'd guess. I also am involved in distribution, so we represented a whole lot of brands on the distribution side, and when we just had a bit of a shake-up with regards to brands, I had been playing around with sort of speaker designs for quite a while, in the background, and slowly sort of developing some models that I thought might be good, and I didn't have really any intention for those models. But over time, once things started to happen with manufacturers, I started to realize that I probably needed to invest in myself and invest in what I was doing so that I had options. And primarily, I developed Elementi for Wavetrain Cinemas. And that was my intent for the brand. And so Wavetrain Cinemas has been using Elementi for about 2 years now. Then something happened on the distribution side, which basically forced me to sort of make a decision as to whether or not I invested in another brand or I backed myself to release Elementi as a commercial product. And do everything that was required to sort of expand,
bring it to market, which is a big step. Having something that you're utilizing yourself is one thing, but to bring it to market, to put it into the public domain, to have people judge you on those things, that's confronting.
And you've got to get all the details right for that to be able to work.
Well, the feedback's been very positive so far.
Thank you.
I've described it as being the best cinema I've ever heard. And I've heard probably at least 5 of your rooms. And since the Elementi went in there, I honestly believe it was the best cinema I've ever heard.
Thank you. It's certainly feedback we're getting a lot. And that's sort of what I would expect. But it's not because I'm a brilliant speaker designer and I'm doing something completely different to everybody else in terms of technology, but the application of how I'm actually doing things and the inputs of what it is that I'm using are leading to the results that I'm getting. So the results are not surprising just simply because of what I'm putting into it.
What is the key? What's the magic?
Everything's like Elementi is incredibly unique. As much as speakers are speakers, and there's only so many speaker driver manufacturers in the world. So as a speaker designer, you need to select the drivers and the direction that you want to go in to achieve or what you want to achieve. I would say what is different about us is that I'm approaching what I'm after as an outcome completely differently. Speaker designers generally are designing a speaker sort of independent of the application that it's going into. They have no control over the application. So generally speaking, they're saying, does that speaker sound good standing in front of me in a black hole, as it were, in isolation? And they're looking at it going, what do I have control over? And the answer would be, I have control over nothing. So whereas I'm looking at the end result in terms of the project and how it gets implemented into the project, and how the room gets designed acoustically, because that's my background. Where once again, most speaker manufacturers wouldn't be considering acoustics or what the room is like, or so there's certain fundamental problems with regards to doing cinemas, and one is that the speaker needs to be able to play loud enough. And I would say probably 90-95% of the product on the market actually isn't suitable just from that one primary specification of being able to actually hit industry standards at the seating distances that they're sitting at. Once you've sort of dealt with that side of things, then it comes down to getting a pure signal to the speaker. If you've got an amplifier located in terms of speaker cable run 20 meters away from the speaker, the chances of you getting really good audio in that speaker is very, very slim. And in fact, if you were doing a stereo system, which is the way I would sort of tend to bring all of the audio conversation back to, so anybody setting up a stereo system is going to be very finicky about little details.
Yeah.
And one of those little details is keeping speaker cables as short as possible. So having the amplifiers located very close to the speaker is always going to give a much better result. And then you've got options for running the signal to the amplifier via balance cable or digital over something like Dante. And so Elementi, I've designed the amplifiers to sit very close to where the speakers are in the room. So then you could sort of look at it and say, okay, well, there are active speakers in the market, brands like Meridian, Genelec, there's a whole range of different products out there that have the amplifiers in the speaker. But then, like we're sitting in a cinema room at the moment, and you've got an acoustically transparent screen at the front of the room. And if I had an active speaker in there, then I would have to take the screen out to actually get to the speaker to actually service it, which may or may not be an easy thing, particularly if it's a masking screen.
Yeah.
It could be a half-day job just taking the screen down and putting it back again. So it doesn't make it very serviceable to have the amplifiers in the speaker itself. It's better to have the amplifiers located in somewhere that you can access it. So that's where I decided to make the amplifiers a vertical arrangement that could actually be installed onto the walls in behind access panels and whatnot that we could sort of get to. And by trying to put those as close to where the speakers are, still getting a clean signal, but making it a serviceable room. The other side of it is by removing the amplifiers out of the rack, you're removing most of the heat. And that if you've got a digital amplifier in a rack, they may not be generating that much heat in and of themselves. It depends on the design, but there are typically other things in the rack which will cause problems. So it's quite common for people to sort of think, I'll put the power amplifiers at the bottom of the rack. I'll put the preamp above that, and I'll put the sources above that. But there's certain preamps in the market that actually generate a huge amount of heat, and heat won't rise naturally if there's something hot at the top of that pile. So with one of the brands we were distributing, we saw a huge amount of failures in the power supply of the digital amplifiers for that reason, that they were just overheating. So removing that heat potential out of the rack and removing those elements out of the rack, you've actually got a much simpler rack to deal with, a lot less heat, a lot easier to ventilate. So as I said, Elementi, in terms of its fundamental sort of principles, in terms of how I started to go about what it should be, was derived from what makes a good project, and how do you address those issues. And so that's probably the biggest distinguishing factor between how I've gone about things. Apart from that, it's really the technology that we've put into it. So I've definitely sought out the best transducers I could get, the best drivers, and I've certainly, from a technology point of view, looked at the best of what's available in the market, and whether or not I've just selected things at the right time or not. I know that all of my competitors are not using similar technology. So they're using technology that they've used for a while and haven't seemed to have evolved. So certainly I'm at the cutting edge in terms of what's available technology-wise in terms of the amplifiers that I'm using.
Yeah, I noticed like when you talk about the SPL level, like the smallest speaker in the range, which is I think the Firefly that I'm looking at there, 122 dB continuous. That is insane amount of SPL from your smallest speaker.
Yeah, but even that speaker is still only capable of playing at reference level at about 6 meters. Yeah. Now, most cinema rooms that we design at Wavetrain, that would be pretty much every cinema that we do has that requirement as a minimum.
Yep.
So now the thing too with what we've actually stipulated there with regard to sound pressure level is we've actually got headroom on top of those ratings. So we're always allowing a 3 dB of headroom on top of our ratings, so that the amplifier's never actually been pushed when it's actually achieving those sound pressure levels. Now this is something that you would get in a commercial cinema application. So if you had a Dolby certified cinema, they would actually stipulate that you had 3 dB of headroom. Now 3 dB of headroom is actually double the power. So of our amplifier power, half of that is actually spare. So to get those sound pressure levels, you need to select initially the right transducers. And in terms of, we've got very distinct lines, of which I'm sure we'll get into. And each series of drivers has been selected as that as a primary goal.
Yeah.
So talking a bit more about Elementi as a whole, I mean, I think the name's awesome, so good job on that. But what was the inspiration, if any, in terms of the product lines? I know they're all very Elements. Was that as simple as that? Or?
Yes and no. I mean, certainly the first speakers to come into existence were the Air series, and that's actually what I was focused on from the earliest time. The transducer that we're using for the tweeter is just very different. It's almost the perfect driver. Its frequency response is incredibly flat. It goes above 20,000 hertz. Its phase response is near perfect. It's just if you're going to select it purely from an engineering point of view, you would select that driver.
Yeah.
More often than not. So that's where I'd spent a lot of my time. The compression driver series I developed more for the fact that I was actually releasing that then into the wider market. And most of the market is compression drivers. And part of the reason for that is because if you want to do high sound pressure level, and you want to do it inexpensively, the best way to do that is a compression driver.
Yeah.
So they're very widely used, and they're widely used in cinemas. So I would describe it that most people would say that they're a cinematic sound because it's what they're used to listening to, and it does have a particular signature to the sound. So I developed the Fire series relating to sort of that. And if you think about it, a compression driver system, it's really firing the sound at you, and it's really dynamic and it has a visceral sort of effect to it, so that you have a real emotional sort of response to it. So hence the word fire actually sort of is part of what the sound actually, or what you're experiencing with the sound.
Yeah, it kind of translates.
Yeah. And then the Air series, the Air speakers are not firing the sound at you at all. They're resonating the sound in front of you, and it's almost just like the soundstage is floating in front of you. So you tend to relax. Once again, you have sort of the reverse physical sort of reaction to the sound. in that you just relax into the sound and like, oh wow, this is really nice.
Yeah.
So the air sort of fit with that. Earth subwoofers sitting on the floor, deep bass. Yeah, it just sort of, and then water surrounding you. That's sort
really ties in, I guess.
Sort of all tied together.
Yeah.
So I went through a whole iteration of of different names and some weird and wacky ones that
didn't make the cut.
Didn't make the cut. Yeah, I won't go into some of the names. There were a couple there that were like, oh, I really want to go that direction.
Yeah.
And but it was just Elementi just fit everything just perfectly. And
yeah, I guess it encumbers everything really in what you're trying to achieve with the brand.
Yeah.
And I think really good job on the brand as a whole. And obviously you launched it during the pandemic, so I'm sure that came with some challenges.
Yeah, massive challenges.
Yeah.
So primarily just I wanted the company to operate a certain way. So from a manufacturing point of view, in terms of when we got an order, how that was going to be handled, what the lead times would be. And everything from the design up was based around how I would manufacture, how do I simplify things down, how do I streamline that process. I didn't just design the speakers independent of that thought process. I'm a very detailed thinker, so I was thinking of the end outcome in terms of how we actually manufactured from the very beginning.
Yeah.
How I sort of simplified things down, but we just like everybody else are struggling to get the parts that we need to get, and also everybody's busy. So trying to get a joiner to manufacture cabinets for us when they've got so much other work and they've not done what we're doing before. Even just something as simple as that is a difficult process. So everything's just taking a lot longer. We've had to order way out in advance, whereas originally we thought we'd be getting things like amplifiers within a very short time period. We're now ordering 9 months out.
Yeah, wow.
And sort of making sure that we aren't going to run out of anything, so that we can once we've. Like now we're doing a little bit more of a hard launch with sort of, like this podcast and Stereonet, and making a more defined effort to get the product out into the market. We're going to now need to match expectation and meet demand. And I think we're pretty much set for that now.
Going back into your amplifiers, I noticed obviously the implementation of digital inputs such as Dante.
Yep.
Is that a problem you identified, or is that more of a flexibility option?
No, it's my preference in terms of where it should go.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how. I mean, you can pay a fortune for a digital to analog converter, but any digital to analog converter is going to actually have an impact on the sound. Yeah. So once again, it just comes back to what's the purest way that I can get a signal to the amplifier and to the speaker, and keeping everything in the digital domain from end to end is going to be the best opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
So then it's only got a DA conversion in the digital amplifier just before it goes out to the speaker. It depends on the system as to how something's been wired, but it might be sort of 1 to 3 different DA to AD points that you're actually eliminating by doing it that way. It's just a case of, is that going to give me a potentially better signal? Yes. So should we do it that way? Definitely. Doesn't mean that we don't have the option there for balanced audio. But if you want to take things to the nth degree, then I'd certainly recommend a Dante, not an AES input. You can't really run AES to the way we've got our amplifiers set up. AES is sort of more of a short signal run, and you need a preamp on the other end of the AES to actually control volume, because AES doesn't. If you're going to control volume from AES, you're actually going to drop resolution in the process.
Right.
It's the only way to adjust volume. Whereas Dante is different. So Dante is carrying the signal, but it's also carrying information with regards to volume, and that's controlling essentially a preamp in the other at the other end.
Yeah, nice.
So your product line that you carry as part of distribution is capable of implementing that?
Yes.
So you can do end-to-end digital?
Yes, definitely. So it's just keep it simple, stupid. You know, the way of doing a good stereo system is basically how can I keep this simple? And from an electronics point of view, it's basically how many DA to AD conversions can I take out and keep this as clean as possible, particularly when everything's being done in the digital domain. So I've got digital amplifiers with digital processing on board. I want to give them a digital signal. I don't want to come out of an analog output on a preamp and then feed back in. Or there's some systems out there that require an analog output out of a preamp into a processor that then converts it back to digital, then that converts it back to analog, back out to, so.
Yeah, I think unless you really think about it, you don't realize how many times that conversion can take place. You can go, when the digital processing happens in the AVR or the surround processor and then is output balanced, then goes into an amplifier with DSP.
Yep.
Converted at least 2 times.
Yes.
Each way.
Yep.
I mean, so I think you said that your airline was predominantly your first product that you conceived.
Yep.
That's still exclusive to you as Wavetrain, or is that going to come to the broader market?
I'm keeping it as a Wavetrain product.
Yeah.
It's a very unique product in the market. So the compression drivers is what everybody's sort of pretty much used to. Yeah. I would tend to say there really isn't anything in the market that's sort of like Air. The closest, I guess, would be maybe brands like Wisdom, Steinway, maybe Alcons, that sort of thing. So compression drivers is what most people know. They understand quite easily. There's a lot of products on the market in the home cinema segment that are sort of targeted that direction.
It's not my favorite driver type.
No. I mean, as it sort of indicated, I'm interested in the end result in terms of the acoustics of the room, not just the speaker. I want to ensure that these speakers are going into rooms that are going to give them the best opportunity to be heard the way they should be heard. Air is sort of the pinnacle of what I've done, so I certainly, within Wavetrain, I've got complete control over how they get implemented. But even through Cogworks, where Fi is being distributed, Cogworks still has a design service to engineer the projects. Yeah. Or the other side of it would be if there's dealers that have good education and we know are of a certain standard, then basically we will certify those people to say, yep, you can go to them and they'll take care of you, and we know they're going to consider the room and the acoustics and make sure that this is being implemented correctly.
I was originally doing, very low end, by comparatively speaking, very low end rooms that I didn't realize that you could go to the level of detail and get such drastically better outcomes by understanding the acoustics of a room and knowing how to actually implement systems into a space with the consideration of the acoustic environment.
Yep.
Brands like Art Novian, we did some training with George, that was so enlightening in terms of, he's insanely, advanced in terms of his acoustic engineering ability, but, just to convey that to people like us who have to actually just put something in a room to make it sound good, he's done all the hard work for us.
Yes. Well, it's critical from the point of view that we don't want to EQ so that system that you heard at Wavetrain, that wasn't EQ'd above 250 hertz. Right. So what you were hearing was the speaker natural, and then the fact that we've actually engineered the room to get the result that we wanted to get. Yeah. And when we measured the room response acoustically, the result that we were getting was perfect to what, say, something like Dirac would have actually wanted it to be. Right. So that's through the path of engineering. Now, the benefit for doing that is that we're tuning the speakers in one of the top testing facilities in the world. I can design, and I've got testing to a certain point, but I don't have a really advanced testing facility, so I get it done elsewhere. So these speakers are frequency and phase perfect. They sound amazing. So what I want to hear is that speaker. I want to hear that sound that I've engineered in that environment. I don't want to be trying to tune the speaker with a very basic microphone on an automated system that's getting all sorts of information being fed to it, and assuming that it can take that sound and actually make it what I want to hear. So you've got to deal with the reflections in the room, and you've got to deal with the fact or the way that you actually hear the sound as a human, how you interpret that sound within the room. But if you try to EQ based on the reflections and what's going on, then particularly with compression drivers, the system can sound incredibly harsh. So I'd say an automated EQ system on a compression driver system, any compression driver system, is a recipe for disaster in the hands of somebody that doesn't know what they're doing, because it'll always come up sounding really, really harsh. And
that's been my experience with compression drivers. Even in that same room. So, we're talking about having heard that exact room with two different audio systems. I think probably at this point, maybe I've heard 4 audio systems in that room, and like universes apart. And you play loud. Right? Like proper loud. Like as loud as I've ever heard.
Loud.
Really loud.
Well, that's a good characteristic of a cinema, I guess. That's what you want.
I mean, you should be able to play at reference level for the cinemas, which is fairly loud. But there's another level which our clients gravitate to a lot, which is basically what I would reference as concert playback levels, which is a very, very different kettle of fish. So while the average level of a movie might be about 85 dB with peaks of 105, a concert's actually much, much higher average levels. It might be more like 100 dB and peaks up to 110. So if you want a system to be able to play at that sort of level and feel like you're really in a concert, then the system needs to be able to go there. Plus, as I say, like the speakers that you were listening to, the Fire Dragons, I mean, they're designed to be able to run reference like 25 meters. So they're just effortless.
The thing that stands out to me the most, I think, is like the fatiguing experience of sitting there listening to like a compression driver and hitting those reference levels and feeling a little bit like you've been abused. Whereas with with the latest system, it doesn't have that fatigue at all. It doesn't feel like you're being like abused.
No. Although, as I said, for the people that have actually compared the two different rooms, of which I've got a number of people that have come through now and sort of made those comparisons, and I did do a night for Stereonet last year where we got some people came through and sort of got their feedback, which was good to get their feedback. But everybody was actually torn between the rooms because, as I say, the Fire is just such a dynamic, in-your-face sort of room, which is what compression drivers are. But as I said, you have this real visceral reaction to it. You're sort of like, oh my God, it's so emotional. Like you almost come out of it like, oh my God, I'm stressed out about it. But it's like, it's amazing. So everyone's like, that room is amazing. It's so emotional and then they're like, but the air room is just so relaxing.
It's enjoyable, properly enjoyable.
It's different levels of immersion, I guess. You know, whether you're into the in your face type of experience, and it's good that you've got sort of different lines to cater to both, really.
Yes. The thing with the air is the air models that are in that room are half the price of the Fire speakers that they're listening to in the other room. So we actually have an equivalent model in the air. It's just no one's heard it yet.
Right.
So once we roll that out and people start to hear that, that'll change, possibly change their mind a little bit.
Yeah.
What about subwoofers? That's the biggest.
The
that's
earth.
the biggest thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah.
That's the
I
thing
mean,
they're on top.
Shaker.
and this sort of so there's certain fundamental things, not just with regards to the subwoofers, but also with regards to the speakers themselves. In terms of, so you'll notice that a lot of the speakers are neodymium drivers. From a speaker design point of view, there's certain fundamental things that you want to do if you want a speaker to play at high SPL levels. It's not just a case of how loud will it play. So you can look at a speaker and say that's its sensitivity and that's its amplifier input, and that's how loud it will play. But it's like, yeah, but how loud can it play consistently? If you've got a ferrite driver or you've got sealed cabinets, then a ferrite driver is not going to be anywhere near as efficient as a neodymium. A ferrite driver is also going to have a much, much bigger magnet, which is essentially iron. And so it's a huge heat sink. Yeah. So it's actually going to heat up over time, and it's going to be really, really difficult to get rid of that heat because the iron's just not a very good conductor. And if you put that into a sealed cabinet, that cabinet's just going to steadily build up the heat. And then you get what's called power compression. Yeah. So everything electrically, everything starts to change as it heats up, and you don't have that same dynamics anymore. So neodymium drivers are much smaller, they're better conductors, so they're much more efficient. They don't generate as much heat because they're more efficient. They don't have as much material or density into the magnet system, so they don't hold as much heat. And if you then mix that up with a ported speaker design, what you're actually doing with the ported design is actually changing the air over constantly. So the air temperature in the cabinet is pretty much the air temperature in the room. And so you're actually sucking the temperature out of there into neodymium magnets consistently. So the combination of a neodymium magnet in a ported design just means you're going to be able to deliver that power for basically continuously. It's pretty much never going to change. And that's why those designs are used commercially. So if you go to really high-grade concerts, if you go to the best cinemas, these are the driver systems, these are the designs that they're utilising in those environments. So we're no different in that sort of regard. The only difference might be that our port designs are huge. We're trying to keep the velocity of the air down as low as possible. So that we're eliminating port noise and sort of any issues that might be related to being close to those ports. But that's also one of the reasons why, say, something like Firefly is actually a sealed design. It's actually designed to be listened to at about 1 metre. So, and at that sort of distance, you don't want to be potentially listening to what might be happening in a port.
You also see with like speakers behind screens too that don't have like low velocity large ports. They have higher velocity ports that shoot air out. They can tend to impact the screen.
They can a little bit, depends on the screen type. If you're using vinyl screens, I'd say that's a possibility. Woven screens, I'd probably say not so much.
Okay. Good to know. I like a woven screen. Your subwoofers are running the same neodymium magnet drivers?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So
just a premium product, is it?
Yeah, that's right. So once again, in the subs, we do have a non-ported design, which is the basalt, which is designed. It doesn't go as low as the other subs in its frequency response, but it's designed to be a shallow form factor, so that you can actually get it up against the walls and into the right locations in the room. It's if you were going to do something like bass steering, for instance, then that would be the subwoofer to sort of turn to. And in fact, at Stereonet, we're going to be demonstrating that using the basalt as the bass steering subwoofers.
And are they the primary LFE channel, or is that just the bass driver handing off from the?
That's the LFE channel is the LFE track.
Yeah.
It's then up to you as to where you decide to cross over bass from a speaker.
Yeah.
And then that would also be sent to the LFE channel, typically.
Yeah.
When you're doing bass steering with subwoofers, you're actually designating that the bass from a particular speaker is actually sent to a specific subwoofer.
Yeah.
Now, from an acoustic point of view, I tend to think that people get caught up in there being a technology or an option and sort of going, well, I'm going to do that option because that must be better. So I'm going to stick in as many speakers as I possibly can because that must be better, or I'm going to, I'm going to put in more subwoofers because that must be better, or I'm going to, there's not necessarily a proper consideration for acoustics when they're making those decisions. Like Wavetrain Cinemas, our rooms are the most heavily engineered that I've seen, and most of our rooms I wouldn't attempt to do bass steering because unless the client is actually wanting us to take the cinema to the nth degree, and i.e. they're prepared to pay for that level of engineering and the building that would be required. So they might not have it in the budget for us to actually spend that amount of time on the room and engineer it to that extent. But for our best rooms, our frequency response for our bass is pretty much flat. So in those rooms, we're typically getting variations of about plus or minus 3 dB, which is very small deviations. And in that type of a room, you can put in a subwoofer into an odd position and get that subwoofer to perform well. If you put a bass steering subwoofer that was spread around the room into odd positions and that subwoofer wasn't coupling with other subwoofers, then you're going to get wildly different frequency responses at all the various seats in the room. So, and it's not going to be consistent. So forgetting speaker design for a moment, but from an acoustic point of view for a cinema, the one thing that you want within a room, because cinema is a multi-person experience, not a one-person experience, you want consistency across the seats as much as possible. So there will always be small variations. So if you get a row of seats closer to a wall, you will always have a little bit more bass up against the wall than you will away from it. But the frequency response hopefully would be similar. So if I'm affecting one frequency, if I'm bringing that down, I'm bringing it down for both seats. Yeah. I don't have one seat where it's already down, and one seat's where it's high. I bring it down, and it might be good for that one seat, but this seat just lost all of their bass at that particular frequency. So the idea with bass steering would be, the frequency response of the room is good before you begin doing all of that. And then you're actually telling the bass from certain speakers to go to specific subwoofers that are located around the room. And generally speaking, that would be a setup whereby you could address it as front, rear, sides. Right. Yeah. And once that's done, a bass steering done well is it's just another level. It's, right. To hear a bass note clearly going through the room is really quite amazing. But as I said, if it wasn't done well, it would just sound horrible.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things where until you realize the level of detail with which you can go to and the level of resolution that you can achieve, you just don't realize these things are even possible. I mean, I see very commonly that people will just think that if there are 4 subwoofers in the room, they're done.
Yep.
That's it. Bass is handled. They'll have great seat-to-seat variation, and bass will be perfect. And in reality, it's totally not the case. You can have 4 badly placed subwoofers, and they will perform much, much worse than one very well placed and tuned subwoofer. If you use an appropriate single sub for a room, you can get a reasonable result. And if you use 4 badly placed subwoofers, you can get a really poor result.
Yep. We'd pretty much almost spend a day just on a bass response when we're tuning a room. It's because we're going through every single iteration. There's no easy way to sort of do that. Yeah. Like I could apply principles quickly and sort of go, this should get me in the right direction, and it pretty much mostly would. But good bass is, just a beautiful thing to hear. Yeah. And you can, if you can get little gains, if you can get power out of the system, like there's certain things that when you're EQing that if you mix things a certain way, you get a little bit of free bass back, So, and then what looks flat on a frequency response isn't necessarily something that sounds good. So you have to be able to not just quantify something on a graph, but actually quantify something is the way that it's actually heard. There are EQ systems out there now in terms of like you can actually feed your frequency response in from multiple subs and have the software actually generate what that mix would actually be, and if you put that data into the subs, it actually comes out not too bad. But audibly in the system, it usually doesn't sound very good. And that's because what they're not factoring is actually how that actually couples with the speaker system in the room. Yeah. What they're measuring is frequency response. What they're not accounting for is actual phase or the time domain. Yeah. And with what I'm doing with Elementi, there's a huge focus on the time domain. And that's also why I want to be hearing the direct sound from the speaker. It's not just that it's frequency response correct. It's in the time domain, it's perfect. So on the amplifier side, on the DSP, we've got so it's an active system. So depending on whether or not it's a two-way active speaker or a three-way active speaker, for each section of the speaker. So let's say a bass section. I've got 1,024 points of FIR filters per channel. Right. So a two-way is actually 2,048 points of EQ. So FIR filters are frequency and phase adjustment, and the F is finite, which means it's a finite period of time. So any adjustments made there in frequency don't affect time, but I've got the ability to adjust time within that filter. So the speakers, as I say, are really accurate in the time domain, not just in the frequency response. And we actually preference the time domain over frequency response. Right. I'd rather the time domain be absolutely perfect than there be a slight little variation in the frequency response, which you're never really going to hear. Yeah.
Time, hi-fi people, stereo people are very, very conscious of timing. Like that's one of the things about a great hi-fi system is that the timing is perfect.
Yep.
So I've never really focused too much on it in the cinema space.
Yep.
Makes sense.
Yep.
And then tying those subwoofers to, so you're talking about bass steering being a dedicated subwoofer for the main speakers or the surround speakers, not including the LFE track, and you have a dedicated LFE subwoofer.
Yeah, so you might roll off to the you might roll off from the bass steering subs to the LFE right at the bottom. Right. So if you've got a Bassot sub that that will extend down lower, so it'll extend down to 25 hertz, no problems, and depending on the size of the room, like I've got them running back at Wavetrain, and because there's so much power in the subwoofers, I'm actually EQing them to the point that no one would be able to tell me how low those subwoofers are going. Right. Like everyone's sitting there going, these got to be going flat to 20 hertz. Right. It's like, no, they're not quite getting there, no, but they're not far off it. Yeah. So it's all based on room size. So if I was in a larger room, if I roll off the bass at the lower frequency, it gives me back a little bit more power and efficiency at the higher frequencies. Yeah. So that may be a better judgment call. And if you've got a really good processor like something like Storm Audio, you've got all that flexibility within the bass management to sort of decide how you want things to actually run.
Yeah. So at what frequency would you hand off your bass steering subs to your LFE track? Like when does it become truly omnidirectional and you can't distinguish that location?
The only choice for me would just be on room size. Yeah. Like so, if you didn't think the subwoofer was capable of being
so what like a 15-inch sub just can't push hard enough for a room of that volume. You need to go to something like a
possibly
18, 20 inch.
Well, I don't think I would ever use an 18-inch subwoofer to do bass steering per se. Like if I had an 18-inch subwoofer sitting in a location and I could utilize it for bass steering, then fine. But most of the time, from an aesthetics point of view, you're trying to hide subwoofers as well. Yeah. So you don't want them to be too big. I'd also argue that bass steering below around the 40 hertz mark is actually not required. Yeah. So the idea with bass steering is that so if I played you a note at 20 hertz, you'd have a lot of trouble locating it. Yeah. If I played you a note actually at any frequency, if it was a consistent note, you would find it very difficult to locate the subwoofer. If I played it as something that was a quick, short burst, so it was more percussive, then you would be able to start to locate it, and that's where bass steering comes in. So it's not the consistent notes where you will actually pick up bass steering, it's the more percussive. But it's also, it's not the really, really low bass. Even if it's percussive at the really, really low frequency, you still have trouble locating it. So there's a point at which bass steering doesn't have an effect. And a lot of the speakers that are in the market just won't go down to 30, 40 hertz with any sort of authority. So that's where you would potentially want to be using bass steering. Plus you've got so many speakers with something like Atmos. Yeah. So to get those speakers into the right locations, typically you're not using massive speakers. You're using smaller speakers that can fit where they need to go and can image correctly. And then to have a big subwoofer, which is a big cabinet, often you might not even have the space to put in that sort of subwoofer in the right location.
Yeah, makes sense.
Talking about Atmos and the amount of speaker channels, so with the amps, are they primarily located within a vicinity of the speakers themselves? Yeah,
there's always going to be a case where you can't put an amplifier exactly where the speaker is, but so you're going to get them as close as you can do, and in most rooms, you're obviously going to have room at the front of the cinema, behind the screen potentially, or below a screen. So that's an ideal place to put them. Yeah. At the rear of the cinema, you might be hiding the projector. You might have subwoofers at the rear of the room typically, and you've also got speakers there. So often people will have something at the back of the cinema, curtains, whatever it happens to be, that you can often put amplifiers there as well. So at minimum, then you've got you're at least shortening the runs to like front and back of the room to where the nearest speaker happens to be. The shorter the speaker cable, the better the result in terms of how that cable is going to perform electrically. There's no perfect room in that regard. If you could design the room with access panels and things around the sides, then you would spread the amplifiers out a little bit more. The amplifiers as well, the amplifiers are passive, generally speaking, so they have no noise. It's only the bigger sort of 2200 watt amplifiers that actually have active cooling in them. Right. The fans are still very silent, so if they were at the front of a cinema, you would struggle to hear them even if it was silent in the cinema. If they were right near you, you'd start to hear them. So those really big amplifiers, you'd want to keep them just a little bit further away from the seating positions.
Yeah.
And there's some sort of like mounting modular frame. Is that the case?
So they come in and it's typically a 4 amplifier enclosure. We don't deviate from that much. Occasionally we customize something. But essentially it's 4 amplifiers in an enclosure, and you can swap in or swap out the amplifiers based on what you need to do. Yeah. The 2200 watt amplifiers are a much bigger amplifier, so a much bigger enclosure. So if you wanted that amplifier, you would have to have this specific enclosure for that. The 500 watt and the 1000 watt amplifiers are swappable. They're exactly the same size.
So you could have a 4-module frame and you could drive two-way active speakers from that frame.
So each amplifier will drive one speaker. So you're getting the amplifier is matched to an individual speaker. So the amplifier has 2 channels or 3 channels or 1 channel, depending on how we want to set it up. One amplifier technically can drive 2 subwoofers, depending on the power that you actually want. So we've just set up one dealer, and he sort of said, "Oh, you've actually given us those 2 subwoofers, and we've only got 1 amplifier." And I sort of went, "Yeah, that's all you need." And I sort of went, "Oh, yeah, but we sort of wanted 1,000 watts." I went, "Just install it. Trust me, you got tons of power." And then they've put it into the room, and they're like, "We've never had this much power in a room. Everything's shaking, and we're discovering all these problems with the construction of the room, and so how do we resolve that?" And it's like, "I told you weren't going to have any problems with power." So a 4 amplifier module would have the 3 main speakers and a subwoofer, or 2 at the front. Yeah, potentially, and that would be the basic. So something like a Firefly as an entry level system would be 3 speakers with 3 amplifiers driving them, and maybe 2 basalt subwoofers, maybe one at the front, one at the rear. That could be a 1,000 watt amplifier driving those, so you've got 500 watts per sub, and that's all within one enclosure. And I think retail, we're at about sort of 23,000, sorry. As an active front end, 2 subwoofers. And then add in your passive speakers, which typically in a smaller room, the surround channels don't need to play that loud. They're usually only playing within about sort of 3 meters of the seating area, which most speakers will do comfortably. Even playing off an AVR, it would actually do that comfortably. So same with Atmos channels. They're usually not that far from the sitting area because they're a little bit closer. So in a small room, you definitely get away with passive speakers for surrounds and Atmos channels.
Are you going to bring anything to market for that part of the thing?
No, I think there's plenty in the market that does that really, really well. I'm not, maybe I'm not the best businessman or salesperson, but as you've known me for a long time, I'm very direct. I'm very engineering focused, and I want to design things that are different and bring something different to the market or design for application. There's brands like Triad, which Triad speakers I used to distribute. They were always really well engineered products. I can't fault them in terms of the way that they've gone about engineering their products. So something like that, I'd be happy for anybody to use as a passive speaker, and I'm sure there's other brands out there that are similar. But a lot of people will say, and I've heard this over and over again, particularly when I was doing brands like Triad, and people sort of saying, I need a floor standing speaker because I'm going to be listening to stereo. And it's like there's no reason why an installation speaker, let's call it that, so whether or not that's in wall, on wall, whatever it is, there's no reason why an installation speaker can't be identical in sound quality to a floor standing speaker, as long as it's engineered and built to the same standards. So if a client was going to look for a stereo speaker and it was sitting on a floor in a retail store, having worked in a retail store a long time ago, and watching people, the first thing anyone's going to do when they're seeing a speaker or listening to it is they walk up to it, they give it a little wobble and like, is there any weight in this thing? They give it a tap and like, is it well constructed? And then they walk away going, okay, well, this seems like it's a good speaker. And as much as that's a very basic way of working out whether or not the speaker is any good, it does have some degree of merit, because if the speaker is going to be more expensive, it's typically going to be better built and have a bit more weight and less resonance. But if you go to an installation speaker and that's made out of plastic and a galvanized steel, and you tap it and it makes a steel sound, and is that good for audio? No. there's no way in the world that's good for audio. But if you're going to make it to exactly the same standard, which is it's still well braced, it's still made out of the same sort of materials, it's still, then there's actually no reason why that shouldn't sound good. And in fact, I would say in a small room, there's a case to be stated that it actually should sound better. Because if you're going to engineer a studio, then generally speaking, most studio speakers, if they're done really well, are actually going to be baffle mounted, which is essentially an installation speaker. And those speakers are typically designed for that application. And what that does is it takes out the distortions that are actually occurring between the sound going backwards from the speaker, not because bass won't just come forward, it will also go backwards. And the boundary interference that actually occurs between the sound coming directly to you and the reflected sound coming with a very short delay. If you were if once again, if somebody bought a stereo speaker and they put it into a room, and they might not necessarily know anything about acoustics, but they can hear with their ears. And so if they start to position the speaker in the room, they'd actually start to work out the further I take it away from the boundary, the better it sounds.
Yeah.
They might not be able to tell you why that's the case, but what they're actually doing is eliminating boundary interference.
And they find themselves trying to sit the speaker a metre out into the room in their cinema, and it just doesn't work at all.
Yeah, it doesn't work. And you see that a lot. You know, people saying, "Oh, I've got floor standing speakers, and where have I stuck it? I've stuck it in the corner of the room."
Experienced that exactly.
Push them as far away out of the way as possible, and then you end up compromising the quality.
Yeah.
What else do we need to know about these products? How you're getting them to market? I see you've got a couple of dealers starting to get their showrooms up and running.
Yeah, we've actually limited it.
Yeah.
So I've actually directed everybody to not put on dealers, so there's only select dealers that we're working with at the moment. And that's primarily because we knew we were going to have a supply problem.
Yeah.
And I needed time to actually get the supply side actually resolved. Even then, we've struggled to keep up with demand. We're holding them back because the response from everybody that's heard them has been very positive. And there's certainly demand there. I think we've got 190 amplifiers on order at the moment.
Right.
Wow.
And by the time they land, I know they'll all be gone. So it's
So you're suffering the same supply chain issues that the rest of the industry is suffering.
Same supply chain issues, yes, but also I know the demand is there.
Yeah.
So we're doing the Stereonet HiFi show, as you know. That's going to be a real sort of hard launch for the public in terms of they're going to be able to really hear it for the first time, and after that we'll start to open it up more. And now we're sort of very much set up for that. Yeah. We've just got to invest enough money into the company to make sure that we're ordering far enough out to make it all work.
I'm sure you'll have a lot of interest after the Hi-Fi show with that amount of people rolling through that show.
I'm really keen for it because I want to take on everybody. I want to take on all comers. Yeah. I've designed these products to be the best certainly available in the Australian market. And I want to take on the best companies in the world because that's what I designed the product to be. And I want to prove that to people. And I think one lesson, and I think that'll start to take shape.
I agree. I think it'll be really interesting to get people's feedback as they come through that demo.
Yep.
It'll be good.
So in terms of things that are unusual in the range, so the Firefly is probably one of the most unusual speakers. So the Firefly, so most compression driver systems tend to beam a little bit in the high frequency, and and they're not particularly pleasant to listen to if you're too close to the compression driver. And that's an issue for doing surround channels, because I would tend to argue that compression drivers really aren't the best surround channels in the world. You need to be a good sort of 1.5 meters, 2 meters away from the speaker before it really starts to sound nice to listen to. So the issue with that is that you're hearing the sound directly out of the compression driver, whereas the Firefly, that's not happening. So it's a very, very unusual tweeted design. There's no direct path between the listener's ear and the compression driver. The sound from the compression driver is actually being forced through this dispersion horn that's all integrated into the driver, and then it's got a 120-degree horizontal spread and 40 degrees vertical.
Right.
Now,
Wow.
so when I was testing this, I mean, I knew what I was getting from a specification point of view, but there's always a difference between getting something and actually and theorizing what it's going to be like and actually listening to it.
Yeah.
And there's been 1 or 2 designs where I've actually gone, no, doesn't work, toss that one out, and start again. The Firefly, I was demonstrating, I was using that as a stereo system, and you can walk up to about 1 meter in front of where the speakers are positioned and still hear stereo clearly. And you can walk all the way around the speaker, and the frequency response really doesn't change. And from a surround sound speaker, that's the perfect speaker. Yeah. The reason why you would put in a lot of additional channels in terms of, say, side channels on an Atmos system is partly because you want consistency in the sound field. But if you've got a speaker that's actually dispersing in that type of pattern, you don't need many speakers to actually create a huge sound field. So in most cinemas where you might have to put 2 speakers on the side wall, you can potentially put 1 speaker on the sidewall in the right position and then rear surrounds and actually get complete uniform coverage around the entire seating area. That coupled with the fact that it's still a high SPL speaker makes it, the perfect sort of surround channel. And this is something where with say the air systems that we're doing, because all the air speakers have a similar sort of dispersion pattern. When you've got a speaker that has that big of a soundstage, the soundstage is once again a seamless, like left to right, panning of sounds and
even on big screens.
Yeah, but on a small system, the sound is a lot bigger. The soundstage is a lot bigger than what you would typically expect to hear. On a speaker system, which is much more of a direct sound, you're going to clearly define where the left and right is, but with a speaker with a really wide soundstage, you're going to get a much bigger sound across the screen. The sound is going to extend past the screen. Right. And so, yeah, it really is a very unusual speaker and a good entry point into Elementi. And with regards to the air range of products, something like the Sirocco, the dispersion range on the Zephyr is 160 degrees. So basically you put it up against a wall. Yeah. There's nowhere in terms of the seating positions that can't hear that really well. With the Siroccos, though, because we're using the same driver in the Sirocco, it's just got a waveguide attached. So the idea with the waveguide is the waveguide concentrates the sound. So it's got a narrower dispersion in terms of its horizontal dispersion because it's a lot further away from you, so it still works perfectly fine. So that's 100 degrees dispersion with that particular driver. But the Sirocco, the waveguides are actually not, so we've got different waveguides for the different speakers. So a left speaker is actually tilted in 10 degrees. So,
so really focusing in on the
fixing your first reflection issue.
Yep. So right speaker, same thing. It's focused once again 10 degrees back, and the center channel is even in all directions. So, so the speaker is specific for left, center, right in that application. So once again, looking at the room and concentrating on the seating area rather than designing a speaker that's sort of blind. Yeah. Like I've designed the speaker and that's what it is, and you use it how you want to use it.
Conscious to the room. Do you still need to? Would you still angle your speaker 15 degrees into the room, or would you just set it flat to the wall?
At that point you don't need to.
Right.
If you got a 10-degree angle effectively on the speaker, there is no need to. Yep.
Cool.
Yep. Which once again means that you can have the whole array tighter to the wall. You can have the screen tighter to the wall. So once again, in small rooms, that's going to be important for getting the screen size that people want, because it's not just a case of like with 4K now you can do quite large screens. A lot of the rooms actually are restrictive for getting a large screen just simply because of the throw distance of projectors that are available. So if you've got to bring the screen further out from the wall to get it to work, then you're shortening the throw distance for the projector. It may or may not work. And often, as I say, a lot of our dealers are seeing that as a big problem.
Just with one of the other things that I sort of harp on about is that's come to my attention more recently is the dynamics of a cinema speaker in a cinema environment. Is it the case that they have to be really high efficiency in order to produce a higher level of dynamics? Is that the characteristic of a sensitive speaker? Like the more sensitive speaker,
dynamics is different to sound pressure level. From the point of view that dynamics can really only be sort of discerned in terms of the noise floor of the room that you're in. So in terms of the industry and the standards, at least, if the system can play at 105 dB with 3 dB of headroom, then that's the highest standard for, say, a Dolby certified cinema. So if I can play at 105 dB, then my dynamics is the difference between that highest sound that I can hear and the quietest. So once again, getting back to the engineering of the room and what the noise floor of that room is. So things that would influence that would be if the room wasn't sound isolated particularly well and you could hear outside noises, then that could be the noise floor. Things inside the room that would typically be noisy would be the projector or the air conditioning, or it could be other things in the room that just rattle and move around that also affect the noise floor. If you, I think you did training with me a long time ago when I was doing acoustic training courses. And I have a sound isolated room. So part of what I do within that training is actually start to shut everything off. So I'd ask everyone, what's the loudest thing that you can hear in the room? And I was like, okay, the projector, typically. So, okay, well, let's turn that off. Okay, what's the next thing that you can actually hear? And it's like, we can hear a little bit of air moving. I mean, it's pretty damn quiet. And it's like, okay, so let's turn the air conditioning system off. What can you hear now? And it'd be somebody could sort of go, I can hear the whirring of the disc in the player 3 meters away, right? It's like, okay, so I'll turn that off. I mean, that's not necessarily like you're going to have a disc playing potentially, but in each case, it's like, okay, the noise floor is going down, and when you've got it down to that, and people are then listening to the room and going, oh my God, it's quiet in here. Like I thought I knew what quiet was. Now this is quiet. So in terms of a basic home cinema, so there's what's termed noise criteria or an NC rating. So in terms of a noise criteria, an NC rating of 25 is sort of acceptable for most home cinemas. And that's sort of reasonably achievable if you're sort of just paying attention to things. And if you've got a quiet projector, typically running on eco mode, you might sort of still hit the NC 25 sort of level. But if you wanted to have a high fidelity sound system that you really wanted to get the benefits out of, and you can't, if you're going to play it to industry standards, you're not going to be able to play it beyond that 105. then you would definitely want to quieten it down further and pay attention to those things. Same as you'd want to pay attention to the acoustics of the room. And
what I think I find is that some speakers have the ability to be like, let's say that you've got a low end noise floor of 25 dB and you can hit 105. There will be speakers that typically, when they're playing the quiet sounds are still louder and the loud sounds are less loud. So it's just like the speaker doesn't have the difference in its high and low SPL points. It's just sort of like the speaker has a narrower band with which to play back,
right?
As opposed to like an efficient speaker which can play, whisper quiet and then still go hard. Is that an efficiency thing? Is that purely a speaker efficiency thing, or is that just
shouldn't be? I mean, it's certainly certain drivers, like a compression driver, is going to sound dynamic, airy, and sound really detailed in the high end and whatnot. And maybe a speaker is really damped, but that would be reflected in its frequency response, regardless of volume.
Right.
So the other side of it might be theoretically, yes, it can play at those volume levels, but as I was talking about before, if it's actually been playing at those volume levels for any length of time, it's actually got heat sink and it's actually compressing and no longer sounds dynamic.
Yeah, maybe that's my experience, because I find myself now just like, oh, what's the efficiency of the speaker? What's the efficiency of this speaker? Like it's the be all and end all. Because I literally, my experience have been with just 85 dB sensitive speakers. They literally just don't cut it in cinema.
Yeah, but I mean, if you've got a speaker that's 85 dB sensitivity, you're not going to be playing at 105 dB in any room.
Yeah, just can't get that much power to it.
Yeah. So and so there's speakers out there that are great stereo speakers. That doesn't make them good or useful for home cinema. I mean, we've spoken about SPL and in terms of distance, and as I said, about 90-95% of product out in the marketplace doesn't do that, because most speakers in the marketplace actually had their history as a 2-channel hi-fi system, where they're designed to be listened to what I would term near field. So it's about sort of 2.5 to sort of 3 meters. Is generally the distance you're listening. And if you think about it in terms of most rooms, most speakers are not designed to be pushed into corners, and speakers are typically passive. So if you're going to connect a speaker to a basic amplifier and keep things really simple, you're going to need to put the speaker where it was designed to be positioned. So if they've not accounted for bass loading, which you would get by pushing it in the corners, and you're going to get boundary interference anyway, you would bring that out to the right position in the room. The speaker manufacturer may have a recommendation for that, but from a boundary interference point of view, you need to be 1.5 meters away from boundaries to sort of start to eliminate that. So if you come out that sort of distance in most rooms, and then you put your seat into a reasonable position in a equilateral triangle, generally speaking, you're going to be sort of 2.5 meters from the speaker.
Yeah, and you're going to need a 6 meter room.
Yeah. The other thing is that sound pressure level drop off over distance is not a constant. Your perception of the sound is going to be determined by not just the direct sound, but also the reflections within the room. So if I'm putting so for every doubling of distance in my cinema rooms, which are acoustically engineered, I'm getting 6 dB of drop off for every doubling of distance. But if I'm in a live living room and somebody hasn't acoustically treated it, it's not 6 dB for every doubling of distance, it's 3 dB. So once again, stereo systems require a slightly liver room to create the soundstage in the room. And so you might have a more lively sounding room where, once again, that speaker doesn't seem like it's struggling for volume. But actually what's really happening in that environment is actually all the reflections in the room are coming back and hitting your ear within a very short time period. And your brain is perceiving that as volume, but what it's actually perceiving as volume is actually only volume in a very specific frequency range. So it would actually start, depending if it wasn't a very well treated room, it would start to sound edgy or high frequency orientated and not particularly nice to listen to. So like some people might go, what he's saying is crazy. You know, I listen to my speakers and I'm sitting 6 meters from the speaker and they're so loud that I couldn't turn it up any louder. And it's like, yeah, okay. So there's probably two other things that are occurring in that room. One is you probably don't hear voices very clearly.
No.
And so you're constantly turning the volume up to actually hear the voices, which actually doesn't improve the hearing of the voices. But then something loud happens in the audio track and you're like, oh my God, that's so loud. And then they turn it back down again, right? And then so they'll go up, down, and they'll never get a balance right. But they'll sit there and go, no, this system plays so loud, I can never play it loud enough. It's like, no, you've actually never dealt with the acoustical problems in the room, because voice intelligibility is something that is critical within a cinema system. If you don't understand what people are saying, then you're not going to enjoy that movie because you're not going to understand what's actually happening. So that's critical. And the dynamic scenes within the movie, you should be able to listen to them at those loud volumes without it sounding harsh or
wanting to turn it down.
If you correctly engineer the room, which is the first thing that has to be done in any system, and that's what I'm sort of advocating for Elementi, is that the room needs to be treated properly first. Then put the speaker into the room, because then what you've paid for, you can actually hear.
Yeah.
You know, and a lot of what you're doing within room design is free. Like there's a lot of things that you're doing that don't cost you anything. Like putting a speaker into the right position in the room is free.
Yeah.
Putting a seat into the right position in the room is free. You've got to buy the seat anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, that's one of the things that I learned from you is that underlay, like carpet underlay, like people get rubber or foam underlay, and it's just like, don't do that. Just get the recycled wool underlay.
Yes.
It's free acoustics.
Yes.
You're buying it anyway.
Yep.
So
I'd sort of like what we do within Wavetrain is next level in terms of and I'd sort of term it that people don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
Anybody looking at us might sort of look at us and say, well, what is it about you, or you're just the same as everybody else, which is part of the reason why I don't ever try and explain ourselves anymore.
Yeah.
The people that are really, really interested in acoustics and cinema design will find us, and we don't have any lack of work, so it's sort of working for us anyway. But I would say in our engineering drawing sets, there is not a surface in the room, not a finish in the room that isn't there for a particular reason. Somebody can point to it and say, well, why is that there? Well, that's there because of this and this and this reason. And the reason might be technical. But the other thing that I'd also tend to say is that like a lot of people might sort of go, like, this is all over my head. Like I don't have any knowledge of all this sort of thing. But you live in the world with your ears and your eyes and your nose. You're experiencing everything. So if I was to explain anything to anybody, it should immediately be logical. I should be able to actually bring that back to a real world experience and have them immediately acknowledge that. I'd be like, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Nobody's ever pointed that out to me before, but now that you've pointed that out to me, that makes perfect sense and it's logical. Yeah. So anything that you're doing in that regard should be simple to explain, should be very logical, easy to understand. And if it's not, it's probably wrong. So we've mentioned, I think it came up a little bit earlier, just very briefly, was reverb times and whatnot with regards to acoustics. But we hear, and I mentioned it with regard to stereo sound, we hear the reverbs within any space that we walk into, and that's how we define space.
Yeah.
So if I blindfolded you and took you into lots of different spaces, you'd still be able to roughly work out where you were you wouldn't know that you could do it.
The scale of the space you were in.
Yeah, and also roughly what type of materials might be in it as well. Because it's not just purely reverb time; it's reverb time based on frequency. Yeah. You don't know that you can do that, but you can. So within a system, if I put lots of absorptive material within a room, for instance, and I take out all the reflections by putting an absorptive treatment in the room, and I see this done a lot, then what you're taking away is your ability to define space. So the soundstage of the entire system collapses and sounds very small, and you can pinpoint everything within the room, which is actually, in my opinion, a bad thing. The room sounds really dead.
Yeah. Especially at the back of the room.
Yeah. Now, that principle, in terms of from an engineering point of view, is actually really quite complicated. Yet I would imagine most people are probably listening to this going, yeah, I know exactly, that makes perfect sense. And that should apply to anything that is engineering related. It's engineering, but it's related to our real world experience. If it's not related to our real world experience, it's not relevant.
Well said. Well, I think that wraps up another episode on the Home Tech Talk podcast. Thanks for coming on.
No problem. Thank you.
Do you want to shout out, where do people find out? We're going to do Stereonet demonstration show?
Yeah, so Stereonet HiFi show, which is, I think, 1st to the 3rd of June.
Yeah.
3rd to the 5th.
3rd to the 5th, is it? Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of my setup days, possibly.
Yeah, 3rd to the 5th at the HiFi show.
Yep, okay. So we'll be there. That's going to be a big system. So I think a 23, 24 channel. So we'll have Christie Digital RGB laser projector there as well, which will be the first time that's going to be shown in Australia. Certainly, I think it's apart from ISE, which just happened. I think it's the second time in the world that projector's been shown.
Wow.
Storm Audio and Lumigen and a whole lot of other things there.
Yeah.
We've got Rogue Home Cinemas in WA now have an active Elementi system up and running.
Yeah.
The Mist Home Theatre or Vivion, Mist Home Theatres, he should have a system up and running fairly soon. We're just trying to get that down to him.
Yeah, he's in Melbourne.
And then Wave Train Cinemas, we have one set up here. Cogworks up in Queensland, which is the distributor of the Fire range, should have a system set up there in the next couple of months.
Yeah. Okay. Have you looked at any international distribution at this point?
Not at the moment. I want to stay in Australia and sort out everything that I need to do manufacturing wise before I look at sort of scaling.
Yeah.
Scaling is always going to be a completely different set of problems.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. All right, so let's everyone get in contact.
Yeah, and a website?
Yeah, elementiaudio.com.
Okay, awesome. And we'll have that linked in the show notes as well. So thanks for coming on, David.
No problem. Appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Always enlightening.